I talked privately. But typically don't even wear them on Sunday. We're teaching. Thank you so much.
Adam's here.
Adam, yay.
Hi.
Charlie, Jason, Nancy, Joe Birch, that's a new name. Hey, good morning, Richard Sheriff Yatso.
Good morning.
Good morning.
David, good morning, and David, two Davids. David, is that snow on your, do you have snow on your sunroof there?
No, I'm in Denver International Airport.
Can't hear a word.
There's something about your, we can hear you, but it's garbled.
I'm in, that's, the
actually
background is,
understand
the background is Denver International
That's
Airport.
good. Oh, now it's clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nancy, good morning. What's your being's name? We
You're
don't hear
muted.
you. What's your name? What's the name of the being with you? You have to unmute.
You still have to unmute.
This is Oliver. He's 7 months
Oh,
old. My very
Oliver.
first
That's
ever
it.
dog.
well,
Wow.
obviously a successful relationship.
Oh,
Good
yes.
morning, Adam. Good morning, Adam.
And good morning, everybody here.
Joe
It's so
Birch.
nice to see you.
I don't
Steadfast Melissa.
Meeting you,
It's
Joe.
wonderful.
But nice to see your name at least. Charlie, good morning. Down in League City.
It's a very,
We're there.
yeah.
Okay. Should we start with a little invocation or
Should we start with our aspirations?
just the aspiration? Okay.
Okay. So we'll start with our aspiration. Always we aspire to start with aspiration, whether we sing this verse or not, but this expresses our intention. May all beings always have happiness and its causes. May all beings always be free of pain and its causes. May all beings always be pain-free and live happily. May no beings ever cling to those near nor spurn those far. For as long as space abides, as long as the world remains, just so long may I be there, resolving all beings' pain.
You want to introduce Ripton Sheriff?
Kebda.
Okay. Yep.
And we'll also invoke, and please just rest in your own open spaciousness, along with Riggs and Chef Gatso. Kevda Gelwanam Tangyer Me Ve Gandrin Sumden Chinshan Lama Che Rutin Jorme Tupten Chasala Solwadev Sonyam Lentarchin Shog Ovmin Shugi Ingi Portang Ne Dusum Sangi Gunging Onyi Rang Sim Chuging Unsum Dunseve Zawe Lama Shapla Soadev. Connecting us to the teaching lineage, which we are sharing with you, and we'll sit just for a minute, just quietly. sensing your support from your seat, breathing easy. And this is the third in our series of 4 words describing Buddhism. And today the word is karma. In recent share of Gyatso, I will begin. And thank you for that.
Morning, everyone. So as Lama Rigdon said, the topic of the hour is karma. I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear that it's not the Taylor Swift song that we mean, which is not to say that it wouldn't be really interesting to consider what the lyrics to that song suggest about how karma is understood in our popular culture, or at least how it's understood by Taylor Swift. And if you want to know whether or not I know all the words to that song, my answer is no comment. It's coming back around. It's coming back around. Now, I want to joke that it's in fact the song by Jojo Siwa that we mean, but you wouldn't know who Jojo Siwa is if you aren't really young, or if you don't have young children, or if you have young children with better, different taste in music than some of the ones I know. Jojo Siwa is a talented and successful 21-year-old. I kid. In all seriousness, though, we could spend well over an hour just on songs with the word karma in the title. My own personal favorite is Karma Police by Radiohead, though somebody roughly my age probably thinks of Culture Club's Karma Chameleon. Shout out to Boy George. In fact, we could broaden the scope and spend a lot of time talking generally about karma in popular culture. The word karma is now found in English dictionaries, for example. It's widely used in ordinary speech and conversation. You see it on bumper stickers and in memes. My favorite one of these might be the one that says, it's called karma and it's pronounced ha ha ha. I even have a decorative wooden plaque. I'm not sure what else you would call it. This decorative wooden plaque like that you put on a shelf or a desk. It was given to me by old friends of the family, people I've known since I was a very young child. And they gave it to me as a gift for an apartment many years ago, knowing that I had recently become Buddhist. And that plaque says, karma means I can rest easy at night, knowing all the people I treated badly had it coming. I remember when my mother, my devoutly Christian mother, saw that for the first time, she shook her head very judgmentally and said, "That's awful." And wrong, Mom, I had to say. It is pretty funny, though. I mean, at least in the way that triggering your overly earnest mother can be. Now, I say all this to emphasize, first, that karma may not seem foreign at all. But at the same time, much of what people think they know about karma, or at least what the Buddha taught about karma, is in fact wrong. Sometimes only partly wrong, sometimes totally wrong. So, to the extent that the concept of karma feels familiar to us, and to the extent that at least some of what feels familiar about it is wrong, then when it comes to karma, what we need to do, in effect, is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. In other words, there's what karma is and what karma isn't. And when it comes to what karma is, we're confronted with the additional challenge that in one way, karma is really simple, while in other ways, it's really complicated. So misconceptions about it are probably to be expected. And in fact, it isn't just the modern world. Misconceptions about karma were really common in the ancient world too. So we shouldn't judge ourselves if we've misunderstood it. But to begin with, let's bracket what karma isn't, and let's also bracket what's complicated about it and leave that to one side. We'll come back to at least some of that as we proceed. Let's start with the word itself, karma. Karma is a Sanskrit word that means action. It doesn't mean fate. It doesn't mean just desserts. It simply means action. In classical Indian literature, it's often used to mean just that, a simple action of one kind or another, whether an ordinary duty or a ritual action or whatever else. The sense in which we mean it, that is when we're talking about the doctrine or the teaching of karma, the doctrine or the teaching of action, then we're referring in particular to the idea that our actions have consequences. Now, this is not the same as saying that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. We're not talking about Newton's third law or some variation of it here. In the case of karma, we are talking about a natural law, however, but we're talking about a moral law. So that's the first important point. What karma means is that our actions have consequences, and the nature of those consequences depends on the moral quality of those actions. This much is probably clear, at least very generally, at least in the popular understanding. So when people say, what goes around comes around, or you reap what you sow, they're making moral claims about the quality of people's actions, making moral judgments about the quality of people's actions. And what's distinctive about the Buddha's teaching of karma is that the Buddha teaches that the law of moral cause and effect is a natural law. That effects follow actions is a causal process that happens naturally. It isn't instituted or overseen and then occasionally suspended by a creator god or gods. And while its operation, the exact details or mechanics of its operation may be a mystery, at least to us right now, karma isn't magic any more than Newton's third law is magic. Now, I'm just using a law like Newton's as an analogy, just to be clear. But this is the first important point that I want to emphasize about karma. The Buddhist view is that karma is a natural law of moral cause and effect. And because the Buddha's teaching is primarily a practical one, that is, it's aimed primarily at liberation and awakening, the unshakable freedom and happiness of the mind and heart, then it's also important to emphasize that the teaching of karma is a teaching not just of action, but specifically of our agency. So in practical terms, it isn't just that our actions have consequences. It's that our actions matter for us. They make a difference. We're capable of doing things or not doing things that have consequences for the quality of our character and experience. We have agency, in other words. So we're not subject to the whims of a god or gods. And we're also not strictly, utterly determined, as if we were merely mindless meat machines. What the Buddha taught, as we've often heard, was a middle way that avoids extremes. And these are two extremes that the Buddha's teaching on karma avoids. The extremes of, let's say, theism and strict determinism, both of which, according to the Buddhist tradition, deny our individual agency. Okay, actions have consequences, and those consequences are determined by the moral quality of those actions. This naturally begs at least two questions. What kind of actions have a moral quality? And what kind of consequences do such actions have? So first, actions. Do we mean literally every single thing that we do? or every single thing that we say? Are thoughts actions? And if they are we talking about every single thing that we think? So here's the second important point to emphasize. The Buddha taught that fundamentally, karma is intention. So the kind of actions that have a moral quality that's relevant to the operation of this natural law of moral cause and effect are intentional actions. And in particular, it's the intention itself that primarily determines the moral quality of the action it motivates. The Buddha very famously said, "Intention, I tell you, is karma. Intending, one acts by way of body, speech, and mind." So it isn't necessarily the case that it's literally every single thing that we do or say that will bear karmic fruit. It also isn't the case that action here refers only to what we do or say. The Buddha taught very clearly that it also refers to what and how we think. And more importantly, he taught that the kinds of karmic fruits that physical and verbal actions can bear are determined by the intentions, that is, the mental states that motivate them. So it's mind that's primary. Now, there's a great deal that we could say, both philosophically and practically, about just what it means that mind is primary. But for now, let's move on to that second question. What kind of consequences do intentional actions have according to the Buddhist teaching on karma? If the domain of causes here is the domain of conscious experience, then it should be at least somewhat intuitive that the domain of effects would also be the domain of conscious experience. And according to the Buddha, this is in fact the case. Remember, the Buddha's teaching is primarily concerned with the problem of suffering and the possibility of happiness, with the bondage and liberation of the mind and heart. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the reason for the Buddha's teaching on karma is that, at least according to the traditional account, one of the truths that he discovered on the night he was awakened, which he's said to have seen directly, in fact, is that our experience of happiness and suffering, our experiences of happiness and suffering, are ultimately the effects of our intentional actions. In one of the most famous verses in all of Buddhist literature, in the Dhammapada, if you've seen or read that before, the Buddha says, in the very first verse actually, "Things are preceded by the mind, ruled by the mind, made of the mind. If you speak or act with the corrupted mind, then suffering follows you, just as the wheel of the cart follows the track of the ox that pulls it. If you speak or act with a calm, bright mind, then happiness follows you, like a shadow that never leaves." Happiness and suffering follow you because what you intend and then say or do is ultimately what shapes your character and the quality of your experience. All of our actions, at least all of those actions that are capable of bearing karmic fruit, that begin with an intention, begin inside us as an intention. And that intention then expresses itself in what we think or what we say, what we do. And then eventually that intention returns to us in the form of our conscious experiences of happiness and suffering. So this is karma in a nutshell, in fact. Now, I want to suggest here that, at least initially, we don't need to entertain the possibility of other realms or other lives to see how it is that our actions shape our experience. There are, of course, obvious everyday ways in which we all know this is true. We all know how the choices we make about when or whether to eat, drink, or sleep, about when or whether to doom scroll social media or our news feed, directly affect our mental and emotional well-being, right? That much is obvious. But when we're talking specifically about the operation of karma, then we're talking about how, for example, the ways in which we act toward others eventually bear fruit in our own experience, or in fact, bear fruit as our own experience. And we're also talking about something that's generally not so immediate or not so linear as what happens when we forget to eat or when we eat too much. And an analogy that I've found helpful in this regard is to think about the operation of karma in terms of addiction and how we develop an addiction. Whatever the causal factors may be, whatever the genetic and environmental factors may be, with an addiction, we make a series of choices again and again over a period of time. And eventually, the pattern of those choices, the aggregate of the choices we've made, it develops a force and a momentum of its own, so that we begin to experience ourselves as if we're not free to choose otherwise, as if the actions choose us as much as we choose them, maybe more than we choose them. And then we're seemingly at the mercy of a master whose strength we repeatedly reinforce with our choices, a master that comes from within us, but then begins to act upon us as if it were an external force. Now, that's just an analogy, to be clear. But what that analogy is meant to illustrate is the idea that when we repeatedly act out of greed, let's say, or when we repeatedly act out of hatred, every one of those mental and emotional states of greed and hatred shapes, distorts the mind and heart, so that subsequent mental and emotional states will be states of dissatisfaction, discontent, and fear. You see, the Buddha's insight is that greed and hatred, for example, are themselves rooted in dissatisfaction, discontent, and fear. So when we indulge those mental and emotional states of greed and hatred, what we're doing ultimately is feeding the very dissatisfaction, discontent, and fear that they're rooted in. And the consequences of feeding those demons, just like the consequences of feeding an addiction to drugs or alcohol, may not be felt immediately, but they will be felt. And when they are, it'll be as if we're forced to suffer consequences that we didn't choose, because it wasn't really the consequences we chose, it was the causes we chose, even if we were blind to what the effects of those causes would ultimately be. So blind to the ways in which the pattern of our choices develops this force and momentum of its own. Again, that's just an analogy. If we were to use another analogy, which is in fact one of the most common for the operation of karma that we find in Buddhist literature, then it would be this one. Our intentions are said to be like seeds. And when we plant those seeds with ignorance and then water them with craving, greed, hatred, the other mental and emotional afflictions, then they eventually ripen in the field of our experience when the conditions are right. But make no mistake, that ripening depends on causes and conditions. And just like the character and the quality of the seeds will determine what fruits they eventually yield, it's the character and quality of our intentions that determines what experiences they eventually yield. Again, this is just another analogy. But in a nutshell, that's what karma is in the Buddhist perspective. It's the idea that our intentional actions ripen and bear fruit in our experience or as our experience when the conditions are right. So at least briefly, that's what karma is in summary. Now, what is karma not? There's a lot to say about that. But there are two potential misconceptions that I think it's important to be clear about. The first is that while karma, according to the Buddha, is a causal process, it is not a linear, strictly deterministic one. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why. First of all, even though intentional actions have consequences, that is, even though intentional actions are causes that naturally give rise to particular effects, it is possible to neutralize those causes. If it weren't possible to do that, then spiritual practice would be worthless and spiritual progress, to say nothing of liberation and awakening, would be impossible. And that's clearly not what the examples of the Buddha and countless others who have emulated him suggest. It's also important to know that, according to the Buddha, even though generally we're bound to experience the effects of past actions so long as we haven't neutralized them through the practice of the path, how we experience the effects of choices that we made in the past can still be shaped by choices we make in the present. So, just to give you one example of what the Buddha means by this, he taught that a person who cultivates a boundless mind and heart by cultivating the four boundless states, which is what we cultivate in that aspiration that we recite at the beginning of every teaching: boundless love, boundless compassion, boundless sympathetic joy, boundless equanimity. These can influence, at least indirectly, the way in which the effect of a past action is experienced in the present. So there's one discourse where the Buddha said that there's a case in which a trifling evil deed, that's the expression in translation that he used, takes one person to hell. Let's bracket hell for now. But the same trifling evil deed is experienced by another person in the here and now, and for the most part, barely appears for a moment. And what makes the difference is that the person who experiences the effect of that trifling evil deed in the present and experiences it only briefly is a person who has cultivated the boundless states. And the Buddha used this fantastic analogy for this. He said, it's like dropping a lump of salt into a cup of water and dropping a lump of salt into a river. If you drop a lump of salt into a cup of water, it'll make the water taste salty. But if you drop a lump of salt into a river, will it make the river taste salty? No, it won't. And finally, this is the third reason why karma is not a linear, strictly deterministic process. It's not the case, in spite of how it can sound, that there's a simple one-to-one correspondence between particular actions and consequences. And in part, that's because causes require supportive conditions in order to yield their effects. So when the conditions change, the way that those causes yield their effects can change. And different conditions will condition the yielding of those effects differently. So that interaction between causes and conditions is a non-linear one. But it's also that there are always other causes that can mitigate the way that any particular cause yields its effects. So the karmic process is not a closed system, in other words. And the analogy of the field can illustrate this, I think. So seeds can only grow when the soil in which they're planted is fertile, when they're watered properly, when there aren't floods that wash them away, and so on. And the same is true, at least by analogy, with karma. And it's worth keeping in mind, I think, that for practical purposes, it's really only a general understanding of the operation of karma that's considered necessary for practice, at least from a traditional perspective. So trying to tease out or 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 think through the way that a complex non-linear system of karma operates is not the sort of thing that the practice requires and is not the kind of thing that's encouraged, in fact. It's said in the tradition that the precise details of how the karmic process works itself out in any individual case are inconceivable by anyone but a Buddha. Though, I mean, anytime that a claim like that is made, you always have to remember that in principle, any one of us can become a Buddha. So it isn't as if these are forever obscure to us. It's just to emphasize that the karmic process is not a simple one. So that's the first misconception, that karma is a linear, strictly deterministic process. From the Buddhist perspective, it is not. The second misconception that I wanted to say a little bit about, to my mind, the more important misconception to beware of, is that karma is a matter of just desserts. From the Buddhist perspective, karma is not, in fact, a matter of just desserts. And what that means is that no one deserves to suffer. When the Buddha describes unwholesome actions, like actions motivated by greed or hate or delusion or pride or jealousy, and says these are causes of suffering, What he's doing is providing an explanation. He's not providing a justification. Because regardless of what the causes are, from the Buddhist perspective, suffering is always a problem to be solved. There may be temporary pains that can be part of a process that leads to freedom and happiness, or temporary pains involved in accomplishing worldly goals that are good. But the removal of suffering is always what the Buddhist teaching is aimed at. Suffering and its causes are always the target, full stop. It's important to remember in this regard that whatever the specific disordered mental and emotional states that motivate unwholesome actions, the root of them is always ignorance, according to the Buddha. That is, they're always rooted in a temporary blindness to what binds us and what frees us. So the model here is not a legal model. It's really a medical model, at least by analogy. So from the Buddhist perspective, it's not that we're guilty, it's that we're sick, that we're ill. There's no sense in which we're at fault, as if there's a cosmic lawgiver and a cosmic legal code that we all ought to know already. And in full possession of our faculties, we willfully choose to break the law and therefore deserve to be punished. There is absolutely no part of that that describes the operation of karma as the Buddha described it. The Buddha himself was certainly no lawgiver, but he was also no servant of the law. He was a physician, so to speak. In the tradition, he's often been called the supreme physician. So his teaching of karma, his teaching that we understand the operation of karma, and at the very least, be open to living as if it were true as part of the path, was only part of his prescription as a doctor concerned with healing our suffering. So there's no rewarding the just, there's no punishing the unjust. There's really only illness and the sincere, heartfelt desire that everyone who suffers from that illness be healed, period. Personally, I really love the way that an American Buddhist teacher in the Theravada tradition named Venerable Thanissaro puts it. He once said in a teaching, there's this common view that each of us has a single karmic account, and what we see right now is the running balance. It's a very simplistic idea. It leads people to think that if you see somebody suffering now, they must deserve to be suffering. So you leave them, which is hard-hearted and certainly not what the Buddha taught. Each of us has lots of seeds. And when someone's suffering now, you don't know what other seeds they have in their field. And as for you, you don't know what other seeds you have in your field either. I love that. No one deserves to suffer. Everybody, in spite of how they may appear right now, deserves love and compassion. And with that, I would like to invite the lamas to comment if they so choose, and also, at least at some point, welcome any questions.
Maybe see if there's some questions now.
Let's see if there's some questions first,
comments.
or comments, and then we'll pick up the wonderful threads that you are handing to us.
Yes, so if we can see the gallery view, just
Many of you are familiar with karma, no doubt, but some of you maybe not so much. And the recent sheriff has brought out some
Adam's got his
interesting
hand up.
points. Adam, hi.
Yeah, I have a question. But if it's like you said, something that's like too difficult to understand, that's okay. But can I ask a question about rebirth, or did that is that
Sure.
too okay?
Sure.
Because I'm just not really familiar with like how y'all specifically view everything. So one thing that I like struggle to understand is like the idea of karma continuing after rebirth, since right the like physical constituents, like there's no self that follows afterward. And so I was just curious like how y'all like view that, because the only kind of like thing that I've ever read about it is like the idea of like that higher level of consciousness, the alaya consciousness, I think is how it's pronounced, but I've just never really like been able to make sense of it.
Lamas, did you want to jump in, or do you want me to?
I'm sorry if that's too much, but that was the
I mean, the first thing that I would say is it's certainly not too much. It is, however, a complicated question, in part because there are different ways in which the tradition will answer that question. So there are different perspectives on how to describe, at least generally, the process that you're asking about. Um, I mean, it might help to say that this is certainly a question that is addressed at great length within the tradition, because as you say, you might say that the basic issue to begin with is how to describe or understand the process in the absence of an enduring self that literally transmigrates from one body to another. Um, so, and maybe what I would also say is, so you are right that at least one perspective on this will involve a level of consciousness called the Alaya, but might help to bracket that. We can certainly talk about that. It would be a great thing to actually talk about um, in some detail. Um, in the most recent Teaching Tuesday session, Lama Namgyal talked a little bit about what's called the Yogacara school of Buddhist philosophy. I'm sorry if this is too technical, but it's that particular school of Buddhist philosophy in which what you're talking about, that alaya, might say ground or foundational consciousness, is described at great length. So there's a great deal we could say about, from that perspective, about this question. Um, but maybe again, this is an analogy, but one analogy would be that when we talk about what we call the person, we can talk about the person in terms of, let's say, aggregates, just to say, let's say mind and body. We're talking about a process that is a continuum. So that's always changing, almost like the flow of a river. So the way in which you might at least again imagine in terms of an analogy or metaphor, the process is that at death, what happens at death is a transition from, let's say, one set of aggregates to another set of aggregates, and the thread would be the thread of, let's call it, consciousness. And if you remember that the karmic process from the Buddhist perspective is really driven by mind, both in terms of it being driven on the cause side by intention, and in terms of the consequences being experience, like conscious experience of happiness and suffering, then that is the thread that you might say runs through a series of what we would call lives. Um, so you might say that that stream of consciousness, and this is actually the literal translation of one word used to describe what we might just call mind in English, like a mind stream. Like that mind stream is shaped by karma and shapes karma, and it's that actually that that unites lives, so to speak. Um, how does that strike you?
Yeah, no, I think that answers my question. I think that's more makes more sense to me. Yeah.
But I do want to emphasize that there's a lot we could say about this because the tradition has a lot to say about this, and there are different perspectives on how to understand this particular process.
I would just jump in and say first, of course, it's a terrific question, Adam. And second, Riggs and Sheriff Gyatso has really answered it. Just to add another angle, in my early years, I was very, very immersed in the Theravada tradition. And in that tradition, there's very, very much a kind of emphasis on the momentariness of consciousness. And that has both some upsides and downsides in terms of theory, but even in meditation, one can become very, very experientially aware of that. In fact, it seems that consciousness is pretty momentary. And so they move to the metaphor of a flame, and that a flame is essentially moments of fire flickering, actually on and off, on and off. And part of the delusion in the Theravada view is that we see continuity where in fact there is a kind of discontinuity of time. There are these momentary flashes of consciousness, they're up, they're down, they're up, they're down. And there are momentary experiences of form. With death, there would essentially be one moment of consciousness associated with this body that flickers out, and then the next moment of consciousness flickers up in another situation. And so it's just that these flickerings continue until there is liberation, when there would either be, in the Theravada tradition, there would be peacefulness with nirvana, and then in Mahayana, what occurs is with the cessation of ordinary consciousness, there would be Buddhahood. But it's all in terms of the continuity of consciousness. And Rinzin Sherab Gyatso correctly alluded to the fact that there came to be a question of like, well, what's the nature of this consciousness that seems to be carrying all of this karmic information? And this, you alluded to what is called the storehouse consciousness, the alaya vijnana. The storehouse, it's, by the way, that alaya is the same as Himalaya. Himalayas, him is snow and alaya is store. So the Himalayas are the stores of the snows, the mountains that store so much snow. The alaya consciousness is where all of the seeds of our virtues and non-virtues are held. And that theory in a way developed in response to like, where does it all go? Where does all this virtue and non-virtue go? And so there was a kind of development of that for a number of different theoretical reasons. But the key point is it's consciousness that continues, and it is either the quiescence of the process of consciousness in nirvana in the Theravada tradition, or the transformation of consciousness into Buddhahood that is the process of spiritual development. But consciousness is what goes from one life to the next. And it's interesting insofar as the Buddhist response to this question is in terms of these continuities of discrete events, whereas the Hindu metaphoric response is in terms of an Atman, which is a kind of individual soul, which is kind of a solid something. So there are these different metaphoric narratives for explaining the continuity of existence. But a very, very rich question. Thank you for bringing it up.
Perhaps a central, go ahead.
Can I assume that we have consciousness during Bardo in our tradition?
You can. That's the thing about consciousness. We're using it. So consciousness, being Rodin-like and leaning forward and thinking really hard about some problem is a kind of consciousness.
Yes,
and
so a question wasn't heard. Can you repeat Selwa's question?
can we assume that we have consciousness in the bardo? That means the state between death in one life and birth in another life. The key principle here, as Rinzin Sherpa Gyatso said, this is a universal law in Buddhism. The whole operation of karma is a universal law, and it is poignant that we don't understand it. So we often hear remarks, as our own teachers, Khyentse Sangpa Rinpoche, I probably heard it first from him, and it really touched me. It's like, here we are as living beings. We want happiness. We know that. That's what we want. But we're running in the other direction. We're creating causes for suffering. So this is the kind of poignance around karma. As we've heard, it's not about somebody deserving suffering. It's about the illness of, you do stupid things when your mind is beset by fever or in panic because of some illness descending. But back to your question, Adam, and the whole issue that you're raising, which is something that is important for us to understand. It was on my list of things that I might say anyway. So that consciousness, not the kind of consciousness with which we calculate odds or do conceptual work, figure things out, a much, much subtler type of consciousness, which is part of what we seek to learn about experientially in our practice. When we sit a bit, we rest a bit, our minds become more subtle. We know that, and that can increase exponentially. So it's something on the very subtle side of what we're going to call consciousness that is a field, as we have heard, and the seeds of our actions stay there. They will stay there until they either ripen, any particular seed of a particular action will stay there until it ripens or until we awaken to Buddhahood. Now, one of the great accomplishments of awakening to Buddhahood is that we no longer have the kind of diluted sense of self, permanence, and so on that provides the nutrition for those seeds to ripen. On awakening, it's like awakening from a dream. You're in the middle of a whole bunch of things and you're trying to figure out, and you're running, you're trying to gather your clothing or find your notes on your way to the lecture, these kinds of things. So you can go on and on trying to solve it in the dream, which is a lot of what we do in dreams. But then you could wake up and, oh, it's a dream. Bim. Those problems are all solved. So even though every life we are accumulating exponentially, seeds for future lives, the key thing to understand, among the key principles here, is that a seed will ripen. It will not go away, and we carry it. Hence, anyone who is now experiencing the negative effects of a unwholesomely intended action is no better or worse than we are. They're just experiencing something that we probably also carry seeds for. But now, somehow, like a flash of lightning in the dark of night, Shantideva says, some kind of wholesome activity came into our continuum, and we experience the positive effects of that. So while there's a lot to say, as you've heard, about what that consciousness is exactly, what's important, as you've also heard in this context, is that it will carry the seed. Seeds, and that we will experience something that is in accordance with its cause. That's one rule. An effect can be a small action, a wholesome or an unwholesome action, can have a ripened effect that is a lot more, it's like the seed of a small tree. It grows into an oak, it's huge. So a small negative, a small positive intention can give rise to an action that has tremendous effect. Deeds done are not wasted. This is one of the famous principles of karma. Something that gets, consciousness is this consciousness that moves, or the series of bubbles, we might say, very subtle bubbles of consciousness that moves from one life to the next. It's kind of like the ultimate zip drive. We have a modern, metaphor that Buddha didn't have. Contains incalculable amounts of information, but there's nothing there. It's these seeds are themselves neither consciousness nor matter. They're this other category of something that's neither consciousness nor matter. And it will remain there until we have either experienced the result of that action or we have expiated it by waking up. We don't meet with others' actions. We only meet with the results of our own actions. This is a very poignant situation. Our intentions, as we have heard, are very significant, and carrying through our intention, there's something called a complete action. Just to elaborate on what you've already heard about, it's not just any random thought or, oh, I forgot my keys, I have to go back for my keys. These are not the kinds of actions that give rise to situations in the future. There has to be an intention, and that intention will have a specific focus. For example, if we take an example of positive karma, perhaps I'm moved by the suffering of people in the medical center, or people who are food deprived in Houston. I am moved. Okay, I'm going to donate to the food bank. I'm going to write a check to cancer research because I know somebody who's suffering from cancer. That's the intention. That alone is not a complete action. The action becomes complete when I actually write the check and I put it in the mail, or I do PayPal and I hit the button, and it arrives. It's not complete, interestingly enough, until it arrives and the benefit is received. And this is another way to underscore the point that you already heard from Mr. Chair, that karma is not this immutable fate. If I continue to feel, boy, I'm glad I did that. You know, I bought a few $5 bags of groceries. I left them for the food bank. Yeah, I felt good about that. That enhances and sustains the completion of that act. If I think, why did I write such a big check? I need the money. They don't know me anyhow. I have no responsibility. If you regret a positive action, the positive karma, you haven't carried out your intention, is not so positive. At the same time, if you, I'm going to get so-and-so, I'm going to tell other people that the so-and-so commit one of the wrong acts of speech, divisive speech. Oh, you think so-and-so is so? Do you know what they've been saying about you? Caused this kind of rupture in a friendship. That's a negative action. But if before the friendship actually ruptures, you regret it, it weakens the negative effect. So as you can see, the creation of a karmic seed is a bit of a complex process, as you've already heard. The concern for our actions being appropriate and wholesome is, of course, part of the path of practice. And the understanding of karma, which in some ways is a great part of the whole inspiration on the basis of which Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths that we have been talking about in our Teaching Tuesdays series, and invite you to see it if you haven't. This is a key principle, to feel that, well, I'll give a couple dollars in this box donations. It's not really anything. It doesn't really matter. Or, well, I think so-and-so needs a telling off, and I think this gossip needs to be made known to somebody else, and I'm going to let them know. It's just a small, it's a it's a little thing. It's not so bad. We're taught in the process of cultivating mindfulness not to dismiss any action as negligibly wholesome, a wholesome action that we intend. As we hear again, it's our intention. Maybe I can only put $1 in the food fund in Kroger's or HEB. But my intention is, I know it's not a lot of money, it's what I can do right now. May it help. That makes that action very powerful. So learning that our intentions are so powerful, we are moved, inspired to observe our intentions, practice of mindfulness. to appreciate the good situation that we have. How did we get here? How do we have this chance to sit in this beautiful room on a Sunday morning? Not for the moment being assaulted by many difficulties around the world. You know, we're probably as safe as it gets inside this room right now. There's lunch coming later. We're not deprived. We have great fortune. Where did this come from? It's not just because we're special, as one tends to think. It's because we did something in the past, some good action. We fed people. We were generous. We were kind. And in this way, we are inspired to good actions and to appreciate the flash of lightning in the dark of night that is our life right now. Make use of it. Don't waste our time. Do what's meaningful. Practice. Practice what will be helpful to the world and helpful to oneself. May I have to say one more thing, and then we'll stop and see if there's more conversation, if Lama Namgyal wants to say something. So, the principle of karma, to believe in cause and effect, is very significant Buddhist practice. What you do matters. And we learn this on the way to later learning something about how the self isn't quite as real as we think. But it's important to notice that before we're taught too much about that in the progression of the way the teachings unfold traditionally, we learn that what we do matters. Our intention matters. And it will continue to matter throughout our understanding of the Buddhist teaching. In the way of what we can call the karmic narrative, it matters because we create our future. And we can see this on the micro level as well as on the macrocosm level. Karma creates one type of effect of our actions is the world itself. If we engage in harming life, we are born in a place where life is difficult, for example. Creates the environment. There's environmental karma. There's no creator deity, as we know here. In Hinduism, sometimes the karma theory is put together with creation by Brahman. But in Buddhism, it's us. There are no grown-ups in the room. It's just us creating the world with our actions. And we can see that habits form in life. That's kind of the micro. And that when we're angry, are we not burning in a hellish kind of way? We might feel powerful, but it's, we're a little crazy. The hell is right now, we could say. There is karmic fruition in this life that is perhaps an initial way, as Sheriff Gyatso suggested, to get some confidence. And, if you habitually overeat, eat too many potato chips, that will be a habit that is hard to curb. Habits develop. We know this. They develop within life. They also develop life to life. So, wholesome actions, positive actions of body, speech, and mind, the 10 wholesome actions of body, speech, and mind, actually make us whole. They make us whole in the context of the part of the teaching that tells us that while we have ignorance and desire, constant craving, by the way, is my karmic song, Katie Lang, constant craving is what pulls us into most actions, and therefore we seek to be motivated not by our own craving, but by our bodhicitta, our wish to be of benefit to others. Let my actions be motivated by that. This makes us whole in a certain way. Gampopa, famous 11th century.
We need to break for the difference between the two classes.
Can I take 2 minutes before I have 2 minutes before is it okay? Okay. So there's people who have awakened from the dream of samsara begin to awake by directly experiencing reality. that's an important moment on the path, they know what we really are, which is future Buddhas in what we can call the wisdom narrative. Everyone has Buddha nature. And all of the negative activities that we do obscure it from our sight. The nature of our consciousness the true nature of our mind doesn't get better or worse depending on our actions. We have a kind of primordial guarantee of awakening. That's actually the ultimate destiny of all beings, the Mahayana teachings believe. And what separates us now from that knowing, awakening to our real nature, is all the gunk of detritus of our own ignorant actions. So as these thin out, we can see more completely who we are, who we really are. And that, Gampopa points out, makes us whole. There is a wholeness in our experience. And all of our practices, particularly the practices of mindfulness, of appreciating the preciousness of our lives, of aspiring to be of benefit to all of us suffering beings who foolishly have stumbled into wrong actions, don't deserve punishment, but find suffering as a result, because it's a law of the universe. This nourishes in the cultivation of bodhicitta, the wish to benefit all beings. And it will replace our progress from one life to another, which will no longer then be governed by karma, which has been going on since beginningless time, but will be governed by bodhicitta, by compassion. Compassion will bring us back rather than our negative actions. And that's a great shift in our life situation. Then we're Buddhists. Then we're just here to help. Okay, you can change.
So the trailer is the first Monday of May, first Sunday of
thank
May
you.
at 10 a.m. We will talk about meditation and how meditation actually serves to alter the cycle of karma and actually burn up the seeds of ordinary karma, yielding liberation. It's a big, big, big topic. Very, very important. We welcome everybody to the first Sunday of May at 10 a.m. Central Time. But we can now switch broadcasts. Do you want to lead the meditation?
Oh, we're